Next slide. So these are the molecules. Each molecule is coded in a particular color. The details don't matter. Now, next slide. Here is what happens in healthy people put through a systematic exercise treadmill program. This is the level of their molecules before the exercise begins. And then at 30 minutes, 8 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours after the exercise has been completed. So as you see, a few of these molecules bump up 8 to 48 hours after exercise in people who are healthy. Now, what happens in people with chronic fatigue syndrome? So sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that, I think, doesn't tell us which of these molecules really is responsible for that feeling hit like a truck feeling following exercise. But it certainly provides objective biological evidence of something that's very different in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome than healthy individuals that could explain it. Next slide. What about the immune system? This is older work. I summarized this at the last time I spoke before this organization, but let me summarize it again. There are, in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, an increased number of a particular kind of white blood cell that normally attacks viruses. You can measure these cells by molecules that are on the surface of the cell, and there are many higher numbers of them in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Another kind of white blood cell, natural killer cells, are not functioning normally in people with this illness. That could be important because these cells are very important in attacking and containing viral infections, just like these cells I mentioned a minute ago are. Finally, there is a system inside white blood cells that responds whenever it is attacked by viruses. And it's called the 2,5-A system. And you can see when that system is turned on, as if it's fighting against a viral infection. And it is turned on in people with this illness much more than in healthy controls. And there are certain abnormal molecules made by this system in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, not in others. And then finally, pro-inflammatory cytokines. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but basically, when you get the flu, as probably everyone in the room has gotten, you feel terrible for several days. And the reason you feel terrible is not actually the virus that has entered your body, but the immune system's attack, your immune system's attack against that virus, because the immune system orchestrates its attack by certain cells releasing molecules called cytokines that tell other cells what to do. It's the code that the generals use to talk to the colonels and the colonels use to talk to the troops. Those cytokines are released in the brain during flu and are what makes people feel sick. Those cytokines are abnormally elevated in people with this illness. Energy metabolism. About 10 years ago, at one of the international scientific symposia, a group from Australia presented a theory that maybe the problem in this illness, in which the whole individual, the whole human being, feels like they've got not enough energy, maybe the problem is that their cells are not making enough energy. And I was one of the people in the room who said, that's just too neat. Wouldn't that be nice, but I find that hard to believe. Well, I was wrong. There is now, in my view, abundant evidence from many studies from all over the world that the energy metabolism inside the cells, the molecules that give our cells energy, are adversely affected in this illness. No one knows yet what is adversely affecting energy metabolism in the cell, but one very well-known cause is viral infection. Next slide. Is there a genetic component to this illness? I think the answer to that is almost surely yes. There are certain molecules that are genetically linked, called histocompatibility antigens, that are found with increasing frequency or prevalence in this illness. Twin studies done by my longtime colleague, Dr. Deidre Buchwald in Seattle, have shown that about 51% heritability of this illness, that twins are much more, identical twins are much more likely to have the illness than fraternal twins. Neuroendocrine gene variants. Are there genes that simply are built differently from birth, that we inherit, that are built a little differently than most people's version of that gene? And there appear to be a few in studies done by the CDC that are different, that are built differently. Next slide. But probably a more useful and informative kind of study is not a study of how genes are built, but how genes, or which genes, are turned on in cells. If you think about it, every cell in our body has exactly the same set of genes in it. So the cells in your stomach that are making acid have the same genes in them that the cells in the back of your eye that are sensing light have. And yet, if you took the two cells, put them under the microscope, they would look completely different. They're obviously doing totally different things. You wouldn't want to have the cells in your eye making acid, and you probably wouldn't think there was much use to the cells in your stomach seeing light. What's different about the cells is that the cells in the eye have different genes turned on and off than the cells in the stomach. And so we've known that theoretically for 50 years, but we haven't had until really the last 10 years techniques for saying in white blood cells, or any cells, but in white blood cells from people with CFS, are there different genes that are turned on and turned off than in white blood cells from healthy people, or from people with depression, or people with other illnesses? Now we can answer that question, and the answer is yes. The genes that are involved in immune system activation, in energy metabolism, in neurohormones that are involved in the stress response, many studies from different laboratories show are activated more often in patients with this illness. Why these genes are turned on, we don't know yet, but at least there is just another objective abnormality in people with this illness that distinguishes you from people who are healthy. Next slide. What about infections? Let me begin by a few general comments about all kinds of infections. Most of the infections that we have as human beings, take the flu for example, are infections that come and go. A virus or a bacterium enters our body, the immune system responds, we're sick for a while, but after the immune system wins the battle, which it almost always does, the virus or bacterium that invaded our body is totally eradicated. It's gone. That's the normal kind of infection. However, we also, as human beings, all have within us a whole group of permanent infections. We have bacteria that live in our gut. There are more bacteria living in our gut than there are cells in our body. Those bacteria, I'm not going to digress on this, but the evidence is mounting that those bacteria may play a very important role in many different diseases, but that's all I'll say about that. Some infections come and stay. And a good example are infections by herpes viruses. For any of you